In today's video, I wanted to go over the tale of Athalor and the Falmer featured in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind's Blood Moon. This story aims to shed some light on the disappearance of the Snow Elves, and while we know what happened to them through the events of Skyrim, it's pretty fascinating to hear Morrowind's take on it. In order to begin the quest in search of the Falmer, the player needs to have at least reached the quest Bar Brawl in the East Empire Company's storyline. The colony's tavern will have been completely built, and new NPCs will be stationed there. Among them is the High Elf, Athalor. It's quite interesting to see him here, as most of the villagers are either Dunmer or Imperial. Sparking up a conversation with him is what begins the quest. Upon your first interaction, he'll inform you that he's on Solstheim in order to carry out some research. This is followed by him handing the player a Cyrodiilic brandy. Following up on said research, he says that he's studying the Falmer, or the Snow Elves. According to Nordic tales, the Falmer live in cold and isolated climates, quite unlike any of their elven kin. Since they're so steeped in folklore, they're often blamed for many natural disasters and local mysteries. Many believe them to be the Reeklings, but Athalor knows better than to believe that. Before he continues on, he hands the player another drink. From there, the Altmer begins to share his theories. He believes that the Snow Elves were a true race of Mer, similar to the Altmer, Dunmer, Bosmer, Dwemer, Chimer, etc. However, he thinks that they simply faded off. The Falmer bred with the other elves, and the Snow Clan was ultimately phased out due to dominating traits from the other races of Mer. He claims that the Snow Elves play a very important part in elven ancestry, which leads him into his next point, but not before another Cyrodiilic brandy. Athalor, the Altmer standing before you, believes that he's a descendant of the Falmer. It's just a hunch, but he feels a strong connection to the Snow Clan and their peoples. He'd like to learn more about the Elves and prove that they're not just mere Reeklings, but a strong and proud race. While he's just a nobleman, Athalor is looking to hire an adventurer, and through the exchange of another Cyrodiilic brandy, it's pretty obvious that he's buttering you up. Finally, the High Elf cuts to the chase and offers the player some work. He needs you to do some exploring and investigating for him. Accepting the proposition, he gives you your task. While it's a little vague, he wants the player to check out Solstheim's ancient sites, tombs, barrows, crypts, groves, etc., in hopes to find some evidence on the Falmer's existence. As a traveling expense, he hands over 200 gold and bids you farewell. Now, like mentioned before, there really isn't much direction for this quest, other than to go dungeon crawling. There are plenty of caves and burial grounds that could be looked into. Going in blind, it could take quite some time to locate the proper quest item. However, only one of these dungeons holds knowledge on the Falmer. By the Altar of Thrond and the Patchwork airship crash site, there lies a crypt called Yolgir Barrow. The barrow itself is incredibly small, and it's guarded by a lone hellhound. At the center of the dungeon is an altar. Placed on the stone pedestal is an incomplete set of ancient steel armor, an enchanted weapon called the Spear of the Snow Prince, and a book called the Fall of the Snow Prince. Simply picking up the book will give you the necessary journal update to complete the quest. However, its contents are quite fascinating and worth the read. From whence he came, we did not know, but into the battle he rode on a brilliant steed of pallid white. Elf we call him, for elf he was, yet unlike any other of his kind we had ever seen before that day. His spear and armor bore the radiant and terrible glow of unknown magicka, and so adorned this unknown rider seemed more white than warrior. What troubled, nay frightened us most at the moment was the call that rose from the elven ranks. It was not fear, not wonder, but an unabashed and unbridled joy, the kind of felicity felt by a damned man who has been granted a second chance at life. For at the time, the elves were as damned and near death as ever they had been during the great skirmishes of Solstheim. The Battle of the Mosring was to be the final stand between Nord and Elf on our fair island. Led by Ysgramor, we had driven the Elven Scourge from Skyrim and were intent on cleansing Solstheim of their kind as well. Our warriors, armed with the finest axes and swords Nord craftsmen could forge, cut great swaths through the enemy ranks. The slopes of the Mosrings ran red with blood. Why then would our foe rejoice? Could one rider bring such hope to an army so hopeless? To most of our kind, the meaning of the call was clear, but the words were but a litany of elven chants and cries. There were some among us, however, the scholars and chroniclers, who knew well the words and shuddered at their significance. The Snow Prince is come, doom is at hand. There was then a great calm that overcame the elves that stood still. Through their masts, the Snow Prince did ride, and as a longboat slices through the icy waters of the Fjelding, he parted the ranks of his kin. The magnificent white horse slowed to a gallop, then a trot, and the unknown elf rider moved to the front of the line at a slow, almost ghost-like pace. A Nord warrior sees much in a life of bloodshed and battle, and is rarely surprised by anything armed combat may bring. But few among us that day could have imagined the awe and uncertainty of a raging battlefield that all at once went motionless and silent. Such is the effect the Snow Prince had on us all. For when the joyous cries of the elves had ended, there remained a quiet known only in the solitude of slumber. It was then our combined host, elf and Nord alike, were joined in a terrible understanding. Victory or defeat mattered little that day on the slopes of the Mosring Mountains. The one truth we all shared was that death would come to many that day, victor and vanquished alike. The glorious Snow Prince, an elf unlike any other, did come that day to bring death to our kind, and death he so brought. Like a sudden, violent snow squall that rends travelers blind and threatens to tear loose the very foundations of the sturdiest hall, the Snow Prince did sweep into our numbers. Indeed, the ice and snow did begin to swirl and churn about the elf, as if called upon to serve his bidding. The spinning of that gleaming spear whistled a dirge to all those who would stand in the way of the Snow Prince, and our mightiest fell before him that day. Ulfgi Anvilhand, Strom the White, Freda Oakenwand, Heimdall the Frenzied, all lay dead at the foot of the Mosring Mountains. For the first time that day, it seemed like the tide of battle had actually turned. The elves, spurred on by the deeds of the Snow Prince, rallied together for one last charge against our ranks. It was then, in a single instant, the Battle of the Mosring came to a sudden and unexpected end. Finna, daughter of Jofreyr, a lass of only 12 years and squire to her mother, watched as the Snow Prince cut down her only parent. In her rage and sorrow, Finna picked up Jofreyr's sword and threw it savagely at her mother's killer. When the elf's gleaming spear stopped its deadly dance, the battlefield fell silent, and all eyes turned to the Snow Prince. No one that day was more surprised than the elf himself at the sight that greeted them all. For upon his great steed, the Snow Prince still sat, the sword of Jofreyr buried deeply in his breast. And then he fell from his horse, from the battle, from life. The Snow Prince lay dead, slain by a child. With their savior defeated, the spirit of the remaining elven warriors soon shattered. Many fled, and those that remained on the battlefield were soon cut down by our broad Nord axes. When the day was done, all that remained was the carnage of the battlefield. And from that battlefield came a dim reminder of valor and skill, for the brilliant armor and spear of the Snow Prince still shined. Even in death, this mighty and unknown elf filled us with awe. It is common practice to burn the corpses of our fallen foes. This is as much as a necessity as it is custom, for death brings with it disease and dread. Our chieftains wished to cleanse Solstheim of the elven horde, in death as well as life. It was decided, however, that such was not to be the fate of the Snow Prince. One so mighty in war, yet so loved by his kin, deserved better, even in death, even if an enemy of our people. And so we brought the body of the Snow Prince, wrapped in fine silks, to a freshly dug barrow. The gleaming armor and spear were presented on a pedestal of honor, and the tomb was arrayed with treasures worthy of royalty. All of the mighty chieftains agreed with this course, that the elf should be so honored. His body would be preserved in the barrow for as long as the earth chose, but would not be offered the protection of our Stalrim, which was reserved for Nord dead alone. So ends this account of the Battle of the Mosring, and the fall of the magnificent elven Snow Prince. May our gods honor him in death, and may we never meet his kind again in life. With the book in hand, the player can loot the rest of the barrow, and then return to Athalor at Raven Rock. He'll ask you if you found any evidence on the Falmer, and that's when you can inform him of your findings at Yolgir Barrow. Athalor becomes quite intrigued by the fall of the Snow Prince. He's more than certain that the prince was a snow elf, and it seems like this discovery will go a long way for his research. As a reward, the Altmer gives you 800 gold, totaling 1,000 for the entire quest. If you speak with Athalor again, he happily explains that his research is taking him to Skyrim. There, he hopes to continue to find more answers on the Falmer, and with that, he bids you one last farewell. Before wrapping up the mission, there is one more matter to take care of. You might have noticed that there was a piece of armor missing from Yolgir's barrow. The ancient steel helm was nowhere to be found. However, that's because it's a part of its own little treasure hunt. At the bottom of Lake Fjelding, the player will come across a lone skeleton. In its inventory is an old wet note. Picking it up, it reads, Winterfist, it is as we feared. Angria and her rabble are intent on stealing the Snow Prince's armor from Yolgir Barrow. My men drove them off, but they grabbed the helmet. I know they're hiding somewhere here on the island. They've been seen before near Lake Fjelding in the Fricked Ice Cave, so try looking there. I'll join up with you as soon as I'm able. Heinlein the Heavy. The Fricked Ice Cave is located in the northern part of Solstheim, just east of Castle Karstag. Going on in, you'll be met with the resistance of skeletons. After defeating the groups of undead, the next goal is to look for Angria's corpse. It isn't among any of the obvious bone piles. Instead, you'll need some sort of levitation or jumping spell to reach it. Angria's remains are stuck to the dungeon ceiling, and inside of her inventory is the ancient steel helm. With In Search of the Falmer wrapped up, let's talk a little bit about the Snow Elves. It's a little surreal going from Skyrim to Bloodmoon. The creatures go from a mere rumor to a prominent main enemy in the game. Within the Nordic province, the Falmer have a strong presence in the Dwemer ruins. While few have ventured into those dungeons, even fewer have lived to tell the tales. However, without proper texts, studies, and knowledge, how can one even identify those abominations as the once proud Snow Elves? It's rather interesting to think where Athelor's studies have taken him and what further truths he's discovered. Now, there was a brief period during this quest where I was a little confused on the lore. I've since done some research and have cleared things up for myself. If you're at all confused or just curious on the lore, I'll go over it right now. Lokim, the transcriber of the Fall of the Snow Prince, mentions battling Snow Elves as well as a mighty mounted Myr. This majestic pale elf seems like a living, sentient, and free snow elf. Certainly a far cry off from the modern day Falmer. However, the author talks about Ysgramor's conquest in the past tense, meaning that this is one of the last stands for the Northern Elves, pushing them to the brink of extinction. It's confirmed that the Battle of Mosring was Nords against Snow Elves. So, if all the elves they were battling looked exactly like him, how then could none of the Nords identify the Snow Prince as a Falmer? Was this specimen a unique and powerful leader to the Ice Folk, or something else? If they spent the last couple of years battling the Snow Elves, surely one of the Northerners would be able to identify this warrior as a member of the opposing clan. Well, to answer that, I suppose no one quite knows what the Falmer actually looked like, at least no one alive. For all they know, the elves really could have been Reeklings, and the Snow Prince was some sort of demon, ghost, or undead. So I can understand the confusion in that space. However, through Dawnguard's Gelibor, we can see how the description of the Snow Prince accurately matches a Snow Elf. Now, the part I was confused on was when do the Falmer get betrayed? It sounds like Ysgramor's conquest in Skyrim was practically over. When do the mighty Snow Elves turn into the monstrous modern-day Falmer? Well, other than the fall of the Snow Prince, the only other text in Bloodmoon that mentions the Falmer is Avar Stonesinger. While the epic seems like a blend of fact and fiction, the Falmer's description leans more towards the blind, goblin-like monsters that we see in the later games. They have their own types of weapons and armor. They seem to attack without strategy. They're inherently evil, are servants of the quote-unquote adversary, and dwell within the remote parts of nature. Of course though, that's exactly how a Nord would describe their sworn enemy, whether they're hideous, violent creatures or not. Without exact timelines in the fall of the Snow Prince and Avar Stonesinger, it's hard to tell whether or not the Snow Elves were already either endangered or mutated. However, there is one text in Skyrim that might help to shed some light on things. It's called The Falmer, a study which was written by Ursa Uthrax. Ursa makes mention of the fall of the Snow Prince. They call the Snow Prince the Great Falmer Leader, meaning that this specimen was indeed a uniquely strong and powerful individual, so it's no wonder that they couldn't quite identify it as a snow elf. Back to the text, it says that the remaining Falmer forces scattered right after the Battle of Mosring. They fled to the depths of the earth, taking refuge with the Dwemer and Blackreach. That's where the Snow Elves, as we know them, turned into the modern-day monsters, as the dwarves tricked, tortured, and mutilated them. They were fed a fungus that made them and their offspring blind. Years underground heightened their other senses and turned their bodies into weapons. Eventually, the Falmer overthrew the dwarves of Blackreach, and the War of the Crag had begun. The battles raged on for years until one day, the Dwemer vanished. With the Falmer free to roam the dwarven cities, they turned their attention toward the overworld. What started out as sloppy, unorganized attacks turned into strategical raiding parties. The fear is that one day, the Falmer will rise up and reclaim what's rightfully theirs, the province of Skyrim. We can only hope that Athelor's studies don't take him to those dwarven cities, as more than likely, he won't be returning. Until next time, everyone, keep on adventuring.